So I am with Sharon Dirckx, author of Am I Just My Brain? Great to have you with us.
It's great to be here.
So where did you come up with the title for Am I Just My Brain? Brilliant title, by the way. Where is this title coming from?
Well, actually, the title itself is a team effort. The premise behind the book we can say a little bit later, but the notion that a person is their brain was the standing point that we had, and actually a few of us were thinking about how we could name a talk around this area, and we came up with, specifically my colleague Simon Edwards, who I think would like a shout out at this point.
Name check, Simon Edwards.
Yes,
yep.
He came up with, what about Am I Just My Brain? And that ended up becoming the title of the book.
It does capture a certain position very well. Who is the sort of person who might say that I am just my brain? Because it's not even I am just my mind, which would be reductive enough. This is I am just my brain.
Yes.
What type of person would say that kind of thing?
Yes, well, this is a view that is, I guess, voiced by some neuroscientists and some philosophers. So, for example, Professor Sir Colin Blakemore, neuroscientist here at Oxford, has said that the human being is like a machine. And similar voices to him have said similar things to that. So, and then there are other philosophers like and psychologists like Steven Pinker, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris have sort of said that the human person is reducible to this mushroom-like structure between their ears.
Right, 3 pounds of grey matter between my ears.
Yes,
is what I am reduced to, and the brain activity. The synapses firing is descriptive of what they're making a totalizing claim that my experience of the world, my consciousness, everything is reducible to brain activity.
Yes, in a sense, there are different expressions of this view, and one of the things that I have done in this book is condense a huge area into a few views which kind of summarize some of the particular viewpoints. But they would be saying that, you know, your neuronal activity, your brain chemistry, all the hormones and chemicals sloshing around in there, they are the mind. You see, it all boils down to, yes, there's this thing known as the brain, but there also seems to be the mind. We have an inner world. We are people who think, we experience emotions, and actually there's a lot of who we are that doesn't seem to be physical. And so what is the relationship between the brain and the mind? And that is really the kind of $1,000,000 question. That's the kind of nub of it all.
Yeah, the mind-body problem in philosophy is massive.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned earlier about Blakemore saying we are like machines. I mean, obviously the scientific enterprise kind of got off the ground in many ways. You know, Newtonian physics is very much looking at the world as more of a machine with cogs interlocking, but so much of what we're learning about science these days is kind of thinking that is a quite limited kind of paradigm to look at the world.
Yes, I think that obviously there are sort of regularities about the brain, and without that, actually, some of the discoveries of neuroscience wouldn't be possible. And there are, every brain has a temporal lobe, some temporal lobes, a frontal lobe, an occipital cortex. There are regularities to the human brain, but I think neuroscientists are thinking more in terms of networks, in terms of this incredibly dynamic organ of the body. It's only really been in the last 20, 30 years that we've realized that the brain isn't this kind of stagnant thing that once you've developed to adulthood, that's it for you. It's actually, they've discovered that the brain is incredibly plastic, and you can train your brain, and what happens there is more neurons grow, and that has an impact on your mind. And there's this incredibly famous study of London taxi drivers where they measured the size of the hippocampus. That's an area of the brain known to be involved in memory, while those taxi drivers were memorizing the knowledge, the layout of the streets of London.
The London A to Z map and all of that. Yeah.
And what they saw was, and this is by someone called Maguire, a very famous study published in a few journals. What they saw was that those that were memorizing the knowledge had a significant difference, an increase in their hippocampus compared with taxi drivers that were not memorizing anything. Yeah. And that's just one example of many ways in which we know the brain to be very plastic and dynamic.
Because the theory that the mind is the brain would say that there would be no way of a mind acting on a brain because there's nothing outside the brain.
Right. It's essentially saying there isn't a mind, there isn't an inner world, there is neuronal activity, and that brain states are identical to mind states. But there are a lot of problems with that, because if these two are identical, then they should map onto each other in every sense. But what we have is kind of biological processes and then what it is like to be me.
Right. Yeah, and we'll get into that because that's a massive issue. But why you? Why Sharon Dirckx? Why are you the one that has written this book? Am I just my brain?
Well, I come from a brain imaging background, so I'm a scientist by training, and I spent over a decade in functional MRI research over in Cambridge in the States and also here in Oxford. So I bring first-hand experience of the beauty and brilliance of neuroscience, and I have worked with many incredible scientists over that time. And I also have insight into what neuroscience can and can't tell you, and where its limits are, and when we start to actually push something beyond really what it can tell us.
Yeah. And your journey to faith was from a kind of an agnostic background. You came to university, and it was really hearing a talk or a sort of a lunchtime Q&A session about science and faith that was quite important for you.
Yes. So I, just a couple of stages before that, actually part of my journey as a child, looking out the window one day on a rainy day, the thought came to me, why can I think? And I start with this at the very beginning of the book, this idea that, wow, I exist and I'm a cognizant being. Why is that? I saw that is actually the beginning of a journey for me to even be having those kinds of thoughts, even though I hadn't welcomed them, they just arrived. But I quickly adopted the view from where I'm not quite sure. I'm not sure that any of us are sure. Perhaps from media, from books that I'd read, from teachers at school, that actually God doesn't exist and you can't be a scientist and believe in him. I've been handed the selfish gene as a teenager, so I was reading that. And so I arrived at Bristol University to study biochemistry, assuming that science and belief in God were incompatible, and went to, in Freshers Week, a Guerrilla Christian event, which is not a barbecue of any kind, but a row
of gorillas either.
And no gorillas whatsoever. And is a row of 4 Christians, and you can ask them any question you want. So I was about halfway, 3 rows from the front, about halfway through I put my hand up and asked, surely you can't believe in God and be a scientist at the same time? And I was told, yes, you can. And they're asking different questions. And this was quite literally rocket science for me. No one had ever said anything like that before. There was no CU in my school. I just feel like I'd had literally no exposure to that kind of perspective. And it really set me on a journey which led me to grilling a lot more Christians over the next 18 months and giving my life to Christ in my second year.
Amazing. And so at that point you were starting to see, so science and faith can coexist. Is there anything in your neuroscience training that has made you think it's not only that science and faith can coexist, but that there are scientific discoveries that actually bolster your faith?
Well, I mean, one thing that we can get onto, it wasn't something that I was particularly involved in, but actually the studies of what happens in the brain when people pray, actually showing that, there's activity going on when you pray, which is reassuring actually, because I'd be more concerned if there was nothing happening in there.
There are some mornings when there's less activity than others.
I guess more fundamentally than that, just to understand, well, before I studied brain imaging, I was a biochemist, and I don't know if you've ever seen the poster of the number of chemical reactions going on in one cell in the body at any one time, and it's just this phenomenal thing to see the intricacy of the human body and its robustness and its beauty was incredibly inspiring.
And so getting into the brain science issues and brain scans, there is a thing called reductive physicalism that you sort of talk
Yes.
about in
Yes.
here as a position that people can take. Can you just explain to us what the reductive physicalist sort of says about the brain and the mind and that sort of thing?
Well, a reductive physicalist would say that if we have these two things, they would say that your mind is essentially your brain, that mental states are brain states, they are identical. And therefore, you can look to the activity of the brain to explain everything else. Now, of course, there are different variants of this. I'm summarising everything. I'm condensing a huge area into a few statements here. There are obviously a number of concerns with this position. Firstly, how does it explain the inner world of the person? And this is where we have to sort of recognise what neuroscience can and can't do. Neuroscience can very clearly measure the activity of the brain, but how do you measure thoughts? How do you measure what's going on in someone's mind? You can't actually use neuroscience to do that. You have to ask the person. It's a bit like being at a music concert on the evening itself and experiencing it all, and then going home raving about it, and your friend goes and reads the reviews in the newspaper. The scientist is a bit like the person reading the reviews after the fact. They don't know what it's like.
Yes.
They can't access the moment
Yes.
when you were actually there. And so there's a fundamental limitation in the scientific method to even access the inner world of a person, let alone account for it.
Yes, and you use an illustration of, imagine a girl born blind, and she comes to the state where she is able to understand the optic nerve and how it, gives vision to sighted people.
Yes.
But then imagine that she is cured of her blindness, and suddenly she sees.
Yes.
Does she have more information, or is she now more aware of what sight is?
Yes.
When she can see herself?
Exactly.
And would the reductive physicalist have to say, no, she has no more information, or what would the reductive physicalist have to say at that stage?
I guess they would. So the idea is that no amount of physical facts will get Mary any closer to the experience of what it is actually like to see. They would basically say that the physical processes are the experience.
Yes. Yeah.
At the end of the day. This is a thought experiment called Mary's Room, proposed by Frank Jackson.
Okay.
Yeah, very, very pivotal experiment.
But you're saying in this book there are other options. We don't have to be reductive physicalists.
Yes.
So if I don't want to be a reductive physicalist, it seems a non-intuitive position.
Yes, actually, it has huge implications for all kinds of things. Firstly, for human rationality. I mean, basically, you're saying your whole inner world is the non-rational forces of nature, but why on earth would you expect non-rational forces to yield rational thinking? There are huge implications, not just for philosophy and neuroscience, but the very process of thinking itself. How do you account for rationality from that point of view? And how do we know that that view itself isn't simply a product of non-rational forces and therefore meaningless?
Right.
So there are huge problems with this view, which is why it was important to write a book, but not just a book that is aimed at the everyday person to access this subject, which is often very inaccessible. And so what I have tried to do is offer three alternative views coming at it from a variety of different angles. So if we think of this first view is that the mind is the brain. Another viewpoint is that the mind emerges from the brain. So this would be known as non-reductive physicalism, when a number of components come together and a physical system increases in complexity, something emerges which is greater than the sum of its parts. A bit like a university is comprised of many different departments, but we also know that over time a university becomes more than simply the sum of those departments. It has an alumni base, a donor base, an international reputation, a development team, and so on. And yet if we were to remove one of those fundamental components, the university would not quite be itself, it would be diminished. And so this view is saying that the mind is an emergent property of a physical system, the physical brain. But once it emerges, it is greater than the sum of its parts. It's its own thing that can then act
and it's not
onto the brain.
identical with the brain.
It's not identical with the brain.
Yeah.
However, it can't exist without the brain.
Yes. So that's option 2, and then option 3 is...
Well, there's actually 3 and 4. But so option 3, if we come at it from the kind of argument of consciousness, you've got people like David Chalmers, who was the proponent of the hard problem of consciousness.
Can you just explain the hard problem of consciousness?
Yes, so the hard problem is essentially what I was saying earlier about how do you get from neurons to what it is like to be you. How do you get from physical processes to a first-person experience of the world? And, you know, as far as we know, philosophers have been debating this for centuries and are no further forward as to how physical systems can get you there. And actually that's a problem with this second view, that it seems to us that no amount of physical complexity can bridge this chasm from, you know, objective physical processes to a subjective first-person experience. It's not sufficient to bridge the gap.
We're talking about water and wine.
Right.
How do you get from the water of the brain to the wine of mind?
Yes, yes, exactly. So David Chalmers' approach and others is to say, look, precisely because you can't get there if you start with physical building blocks, what happens if we start with experience? And they say, well, he would say, look, what if consciousness is this pervasive property to everything in the living world? It's a view known as panpsychism, from the Greek pan meaning all and psyche meaning soul. What if there's a kind of a level of consciousness in all living things? And he gets at it that way. But the problem is with some of that, and I think it's a very creative take and way to try and solve the hard problem, it's impossible to verify whether the tree outside our window possesses consciousness, a conscious states or not, and indeed whether the rock sitting next to it does. And
what would that even mean?
And what would that even mean, exactly? Yes. But it's at least a hopeful awareness and acknowledgement that starting simply with the physical and ending with the physical, it gets you nowhere in resolving this problem. And then there's the third view, which is a view known as substance dualism, where people would say that there is a physical brain and a non-physical mind that interact but are distinct. And so there are two substances at play here. And in this case, they would argue that the mind can exist without the physical brain, precisely because it's distinct. And this is mainly held by theists. A number of very bright people hold this view, many of them in this city, Richard Swinburne, Keith Ward, and then in the States you've got people like Alvin Plantinga and J.P. Moreland, who would advocate this particular view. And really where I kind of land it in the book is to say, listen, if we entertain the possibility that God exists, does that help us in solving the hard problem? Just slightly different take to the panpsychist view. If God exists, then consciousness is fundamental and has always existed in the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The Trinity are conscious beings, interestingly, without a body. So it's possible to possess consciousness without a body in the Godhead. And if that God has made human beings and placed his imprint on humanity, then we would expect to possess and have consciousness and to have a mind. So I guess where the argument lands is that, we have a mind because God has a mind and that we're made by him, for him. We think because he does. We are conscious because God is conscious. And so I think that the existence of God actually helps us very much in trying to resolve the enigma of human consciousness, that could it be that it's actually given, if the forces of nature are not sufficient to account for human rationality and human consciousness, then maybe the origins of consciousness lie beyond the forces of nature.
Yes, and at that stage, you're not positing a God of the gaps, or you're not positing God as a Deus ex machina coming in to solve a problem. You're actually saying, here's the best explanatory hypothesis
Yes.
that explains the data.
Absolutely, and I think that some philosophers talk about where there's a weak point in a particular argument, it makes it more vulnerable to more persuasive rival theories. And I think that in response to each of the three different positions that I've outlined, this view that actually consciousness originates from God is a very persuasive rival theory. Having said that, the non-reductive physicalist position is held by a number of theists, and actually they make a good case that actually it's the breathing in of God that helps to bridge the chasm, and they see this view as being a really helpful way to make sense of the clear connection between the activity of the brain and the mind, and neuroscience is clearly showing that relationship to be very strong. And so that is a view that is held by theists as well, but they would argue that God is the being that bridges the chasm.
He's quite good at turning water into wine.
Yes,
that's
absolutely.
his thing. So the reductive physicalism position is completely non-intuitive. We begin with a first-person experience of the world. I have consciousness. In fact, science doesn't get off the ground unless you've got a thinking, rational being to do the science to begin with.
Yes.
And then the non-reductive physicalist position, you still need to bridge the gap between the brain and the mind. We don't even know how to begin to start answering that hard problem of consciousness.
Yes.
And then we've got panpsychism. Would Thomas Nagel in Mind and Cosmos, is he a kind of a panpsychism?
Yes,
person?
I think technically he might be a proto-panpsychist, which is that actually there are precursors of conscious states in nature. So it's a similar vein to Chalmers.
Yes.
But it's actually talking about some things are pre-conscious, and I think they both talk about there are different levels of consciousness, but it is pervasive to life. Again, very difficult to verify, and what does it mean to be pre-conscious in daily life and in real life? It's sort of
the difference between a dimmer switch and an on and off switch. What would it mean to turn the dimmer switch down so far that you're a rock?
Yes.
Is the light on in any sense that's meaningful?
Yes.
Why don't we start to talk about the on or off switch?
Yes.
And I guess one reason why people don't want to speak about the on and off switch is they have to then become substance dualists. Ooh, yuck. There is that sense of, that's like Descartes, right? Isn't Cartesian dualism? Doesn't he believe in a ghost in a machine and that sort of thing?
Yes.
What are some of the ways that people kind of characterize the substance dualist position?
Yes. Well, I think that's right. I think there's a sense in which it originated actually much further back than Descartes, and probably with Plato, who saw and he talked in terms of soul rather than mind, but the soul was the essence of the person, the life source of the person, that could occupy a body but didn't need a body for its existence, and in fact could occupy multiple bodies in its kind of course through the cosmos. And in a sense, Descartes, through Augustine, imported that into his thinking. Augustine imported some of Plato's views into Christianity, which has led sometimes to a slight, misunderstanding of what the interaction is between the spiritual and the physical, both in this life and in the life to come. And Descartes, I suppose, has kind of imported some of that into his thinking. The interesting is that that's not the only form of substance dualism out there. Right. Alongside, in a similar vein to Plato, Aristotle believed that the soul was the life source of the body, but he believed that it actually had a more integrated relationship with the physical body, in that a particular soul occupied a particular body. And actually someone like Thomas Aquinas was very much thinking along Aristotle's lines when he started to talk about the mind-body problem. And so today you might have what you call, who say, look, just because there are two distinct substances doesn't mean they don't interact.
Right.
They are causally connected, and in that sense we embrace the discoveries of neuroscience, and we say, yes, the mind and brain are very clearly connected. You damage the brain, you damage the mind. You know, if you develop and grow as a person through childhood, your brain is growing a lot. And the two are working together, and they very much agree with that and embrace it, but say, look, that doesn't mean there can't be distinct substances at play. One of the things they would say is, well, how can a non-physical mind interact with a physical brain? And this is not an easy question to answer. I know that some philosophers say, well, look, so much of what we operate in is non-physical, and the way that we speak to each other is non-physical, and that has a physical effect.
Right.
If you receive bad news from a family member, that comes to you in a non-physical form. It has a physical effect on your body, and so we're living in this world of the non-physical and the physical all the time.
So everyone has to answer that question in some form. Even if you're a reductive physicalist, you've got to figure out how non-material things make material impact.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you did both your doctoral and postdoctoral research in brain imaging. So what is some of the neuroscience that actually helps us to kind of resist the physical, the reductive physicalism kind of approach?
Yeah. Well, there are some very interesting observations that even people who have no particular belief about God have made over the years. Very famous neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield, who was a pioneer in the 20th century, he treated epilepsy by stimulating various different parts of the cortex, and the patient was awake during this time, and he discovered the function of lots of different areas, but never did he stimulate a part of the brain which generated a sense of self, and never did he stimulate a part of the brain which caused the person to make a decision, which we may get onto later on. And so there are some fundamental observations from non-theists that actually did influence their view of the world and their view of this sort of mind-brain relationship, leading them to think maybe there are some distinct things going on there. We've got more modern, more recent discoveries of patients that have very damaged brains but seem to be displaying levels of consciousness. So a particular brain imaging study that was published by Adrian Owen in a very prestigious journal, Science, in 2006, and then written up in his book Into the Grey Zone, where he was actually looking at patients in a persistent vegetative state, so there's no signs of overt awakeness from the outside. And now, obviously, in the 70s and 80s, people developed all kinds of ways of determining whether they're conscious or not via eye movements and things like that. But recently, they were able to use brain imaging, whereby if a patient was conscious, they could respond using their mind. They basically were asking a series of biographical questions, saying, look, if you want to say yes, imagine that you're playing tennis, and that's going to activate a network of areas associated with imagining motor movement.
Wow.
And if you want to say no, imagine you're moving around your house, and that's going to activate a whole network of areas to do with spatial awareness and navigation. And they were able to ask a series of biographical questions that could be verified with family members, and they responded correctly to all of the questions. Now, not every PVS patient showed this level of conscious awareness, but some of them did.
Right.
And
scary, but
yes,
right.
And in the words of Adrian Owen, what they were seeing as patients with deeply damaged brains but intact minds.
Yes.
And that's, again, not from a theist.
No.
So there are observations, and this is what I do in the book. I try and make a case from medicine, from philosophy, and from neuroscience itself, that the view that you are just your brain is not sufficient to explain things like this.
Yes. What about near-death experiences? Is that another bit of data that can be, brought to bear on the question?
Yes, well, it's potentially a controversial area. Not everyone believes it's kind of valid, but what they've been seeing since the advent of cardiac surgery is that patients that have been put in a state of clinical death in order to perform the surgery in which the heart is stopped, the brain is stopped, about 10% of patients on resuscitation are reporting that they were conscious. Everything from, we've all seen the programs of tunnels of light and kind of being above the body, and of course some of that could be fabricated and perhaps has been fabricated, but cardiologists in the UK, the Netherlands, and the States, and probably all across the world, have started to look at it very systematically. We're talking thousands and thousands of patients being interviewed after their surgeries. And it seems that there are some that have data that could be corroborated. So, for example, a patient that after the surgery, they recounted a conversation that their relatives had down the corridor in an entirely different room in the hospital while the surgery was taking place, and they retold this conversation word for word. And others that
Careful
said,
what you say about Auntie Ellie while she's having the
absolutely,
surgery.
yeah. Others that say, I saw this shoe on the roof of a hospital that people hadn't been up there for decades, and they went up there and sure enough the shoe was there. Now,
what if someone says, okay, a near-death experience is a wish fulfillment, I want to walk towards the light, I want to have that, that understanding of the afterlife, and I've concocted it?
I think what these studies seem to show is that people can have pleasant or unpleasant near-death experiences, and they can have them whether they believe in God or not. And so the idea of wish fulfillment doesn't seem to stack up. What we can say is that if God does exist, then we can make sense of this kind of data, because the Christian view is that there will be consciousness beyond the death of the body, one way or another. And so it's very interesting that although we're not wanting to build a theology, we can make sense of it.
Okay, so we've talked about near-death experience. What about religious experiences? What does scanning the brains of people who pray or have certain mindfulness or meditative experiences, what does that reveal?
Yeah, so with the advent of brain imaging, there have been studies over the last 20, 30 years of Buddhist monks in a state of meditation, Christians praying, people in trance states, and even the Christian type of prayer of praying in tongues has been, their brains have been scanned as well. And essentially what people have seen is that there are many different areas of the brain lighting up when people pray. You can argue, and again I think the data is still in its infancy, that there are different networks lighting up for different types of prayer as well. But what that has led some people to say is, well, this is all simply a product of brain activity and therefore is not authentic.
And you don't find that a convincing explanation, or you just think, I guess, prayer is, among other things, a natural phenomenon, so of course we can study it naturalistically. That doesn't exhaust its meaning.
Yeah.
Something more could be going on.
Well, I actually think, well, if you take the example of chocolate, when you're about to eat chocolate, a whole network of areas start firing as you get ready to be in the happy place that will arrive. And similarly, they're the same networks that activate when you're in love. But knowing what's going on in the brain doesn't detract from the experience of eating chocolate or the experience of being in love. In fact, those are two very distinct things going on, and knowledge of brain activity in no way detracts from the authenticity of the experience that you're having at the same time. And it's obviously the same with prayer. Nor does it mean that God doesn't exist. If you've got activity in the brain, people have said, well, that must mean that God doesn't exist. But actually, no one would doubt the existence of chocolate or their spouse or partner. Exactly. In fact, their existence is why there is activity in the first place. And actually, the biblical view of the human person is of an integrated physical and spiritual being. And so activity in the brain when we pray is exactly what we would expect. In fact, I'd be more concerned if there was nothing going on while I was praying.
Yes. So let's bring this to a conclusion in terms of how has this stuff helped you as a Christian to process not only your science but also your Christian experience of prayer, your Christian experience of faith, the fact that we are not simply our brains, how's that going to help you, Sharon? How's that going to help us as Christians to walk out into the world?
Well, I think that, firstly, to say that there's so much more to me than just the physical. There's so much more to life than just the physical. There's more than you can see with your eyes. And therefore, there are many things to this world and to the inner world that we ourselves have that are important and that should be attended to. And, you know, earlier chapters talk about us having a soul. You can either feed your soul or you can starve it. But actually, we are most whole when we integrate all of these different areas. It also means that the mind is something to be used. You know, to be a Christian isn't to cease to be a thinking person. Actually, the mind is a really important part of you. That the deepest expression of what it means to be human is to use your mind, or one of the deepest, anyway. And I think ultimately what this all points us to is that, well, perhaps this inner capacity, this capacity to relate not only to ourselves, not only to the physical world, but potentially to beyond that, means that there's a God out there that wants to know me, that wants to relate to me, and that although we can understand the machinery, a bit like the workings, the inner mechanics of a radio, very well using neuroscience, that doesn't mean there isn't someone out there broadcasting that might actually want to relate and talk, and that these faculties exist because God has given us them to know Him and to relate to Him. And so this is, you know, an encouragement to seek God, to ask Him if He's real, to make Himself known, and to engage with Him, to pour out our heart to Him, and to actually, to really pursue relationship with God.
Yes, you use the analogy of the brain being more like an antenna to pick up a signal from beyond that is not a purely physical thing. And of course, you know, what are we doing here? We are two conscious beings having a rational, you know, in your case very rational, in my case somewhat less rational discussion, using language and emotion and rhetoric and reason and all these things. And what do you notice about all these things? They're totally immaterial. And I've always been struck by Keith Ward sort of saying what is closest to me is an immaterial thing called my consciousness, which nobody can have a mechanical view of. And it seems like the most obvious fact about ourselves and about our world is actually a conscious immaterial reality. That's quite suggestive, isn't it? You know?
Absolutely. Yes.
And even as a Christian, it's helped me just to think this week as I've read the book about prayer, and just I think so much of my prayer life suffers at the hands of a mechanical view of the world, and I think everything just grinds along according to iron laws of physics. So why pray? But what if consciousness is far deeper? What if the mind of God and my mind in communion is a more powerful thing than all the mechanics of the universe?
Yeah.
That'll get you praying, maybe.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you for writing this book, and I think it's helped me, as I said, it's helped me to pray. It's helped me to think about the world in a more Christian way, and I think it'll help lots of Christians get on the front foot on this question of neuroscience and consciousness, because I think the evidence is on our side. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So people get Am I Just My Brain by Sharon Dirckx. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Glenn.